in the coldest reaches of the known world, where the land seems to remember every footstep ever taken upon it, there stands a lineage older than most written history. Before crowns were forged, before banners were stitched, and before the idea of a kingdom called the Seven Kingdoms had fully taken shape, there were the Starks. They did not rise through ambition or conquest in the southern sense, but through endurance, memory, and an almost solemn acceptance of duty. To speak of House Stark is not merely to recount the story of a noble family, but to trace the slow, patient rhythm of the North itself. Their history unfolds like a long winter evening, quiet, unhurried and heavy, with things left unsaid. From the age when men first crossed the arm of dawn, to the moment the gates of Winterfell fell silent. Yet the Stark story is one of continuity rather than spectacle. This is not a tale driven by sudden triumphs or dramatic reversals. It is a chronicle shaped by weather, stone, blood, and memory. A history that asks not how power is seized, but how it is carried, generation after generation, in a land that does not forgive weakness and does not reward haste. Long before the name Stark was ever spoken aloud, before Winterfell's stones were stacked one upon another, the North already existed as a place apart. It was colder then, quieter, and less forgiving. The land stretched wide and largely untouched, dominated by ancient forests, slow rivers, and open plains that seemed to resist ownership. In this distant age, history did not move quickly. It settled into the earth, layering itself like sediment, leaving traces that could still be felt long after the names of those who lived had been forgotten. The earliest people to leave a lasting human mark upon this land were the first men. They did not arrive as conquerors in the later sense of the word. Their migration was gradual, almost hesitant, as if even they understood that the North was not a land that welcomed sudden change, bringing with them bronze tools, simple agriculture, and a way of life rooted in physical survival rather than abstract ambition. What they encountered in the North was not an empty wilderness. The forests were already ancient, the weirwood trees already old beyond reckoning. More importantly, the land was inhabited by the children of the forest, a people smaller in stature but deeply entwined with the natural world. Where the first men reshaped the land to endure it, the children had learned to exist within it. Their songs, their carvings, and their silent communion with the trees reflected a worldview fundamentally different from that of humankind. The conflict between these two peoples was not inevitable, but it was perhaps unavoidable. The first men cleared forests for farming and settlements, cutting down weirwood trees whose faces had watched the passing of centuries. To the children, this was not merely environmental destruction, but a violation of memory itself. War followed, slow and brutal, waged with bronze axes against obsidian blades, with neither side capable of fully erasing the other. Yet this age is important not because of its violence, but because of what followed. The pact, forged on the Isle of Faces, marked an end to open conflict and the beginning of a fragile coexistence. The first men were allowed dominion over the open lands, while the deep forests were left to the children. More significantly, the first men adopted the worship of the old gods, gods without temples or priests, men whose presence was felt rather than declared. This spiritual inheritance would become one of the defining features of Northern identity. Unlike the faiths that would later dominate the South, the old gods offered no promises of salvation or structured morality. They did not judge. They simply remembered. To kneel before a heart tree was to acknowledge that one's actions would be seen, if not immediately answered. In a land as harsh as the North, this form of belief aligned naturally with daily existence. Survival depended not on divine intervention, but on preparation, restraint, and respect for forces beyond human control. The North itself shaped the psychology of those who lived within it. Winters were long, unpredictable, and often devastating. Entire generations could be defined by a single season of cold. This reality fostered a culture that valued foresight over indulgence, memory over novelty. Food was stored not for comfort, but for necessity. Children were raised with an understanding that hardship was not a failure of life, but a certainty within it. In this environment, leadership took on a different character. The strongest leaders were not those who promised prosperity, but those who ensured survival. Authority was practical rather than symbolic, rooted in the ability to protect people through winter and war alike. This understanding of rule, forged long before castles or crowns, would later become central to the Stark identity. It is important to recognize that the North, during this age, was not unified. It was a patchwork of clans and petty kings, each tied to its land by blood and necessity. Allegiances shifted slowly, often cemented through marriage or shared survival rather than conquest. Violence occurred, but it was rarely spectacular. The North did not lend itself to grand campaigns. Distance, weather, and terrain made sustained warfare costly and uncertain. Within this fragmented landscape, certain families began to emerge as enduring presences. Their names are mostly lost, their stories reduced to half-remembered legends. What distinguished these lineages was not their ambition, but their ability to last. They chose settlement sites carefully, often near hot springs, rivers, or defensible high ground. They built not for grandeur, but for permanence. This is the world into which the ancestors of House Stark would eventually step. Not a blank slate waiting for heroes, but an ancient land already heavy with history, conflict, and belief. The Starks did not invent the North. They inherited it, along with its burdens. Their later emphasis on duty, memory, and endurance did not arise suddenly with a single legendary figure. It was the continuation of values shaped over thousands of years. The idea that the North remembers is not a poetic invention of later ages. It is a literal truth. The land remembers footsteps, fires, and blood. The weirwood trees remember faces, carved by hands long turned to dust. The people remember winters that nearly erased them. Before the Starks ruled, before Winterfell stood, this culture of remembrance was already firmly in place. To understand House Stark, one must first understand this deep prehistory. The Starks would later be described as ancient, but even they were newcomers compared to the land itself, as their strength would lie not in reshaping the North, but in aligning themselves with its existing rhythms. in accepting that the North could not be mastered, only respected. By the time the name Stark finally entered the record of legend, the foundations had already been laid. The land was ready, not for conquest, but for continuity. And in the slow, patient unfolding of northern history, continuity would prove to be the most powerful force of all. The figure remembered as Bran the Builder exists in a space between history and myth, where certainty dissolves into tradition and repetition. His name survives not because it is attached to a single verifiable deed, but because it is woven into multiple foundations, each one massive enough to suggest intention beyond a single lifetime. In the North, memory is often preserved not in parchment or song, but in stone. Bran's legacy endures because it was built to endure. Accounts place him in the Age of Heroes, a time when chronology becomes imprecise, and individual lives blur into archetypes. Heroes of this era are remembered less for who they were than for what they left behind. Bran is not celebrated for battles won or enemies defeated. Instead, he is remembered as a builder, a role that, in the North, carried a deeper meaning than conquest ever could. To build was to commit to the future in a land that constantly threatened to erase it. The most enduring structure associated with Bran is Winterfell. Even in its earliest imagined form, it was not a castle designed for display. There are no accounts of soaring towers meant to inspire awe, no ornamental excess meant to impress visitors. Winterfell was conceived as a living structure, built around hot springs that rose naturally from beneath the earth, providing warmth through even the harshest winters. This choice alone speaks volumes about the mindset of its founder. Survival came first. Comfort, when possible, was acceptable. Vanity was unnecessary. Winterfell's layout suggests gradual expansion rather than a single, unified vision. Walls were thickened, towers added, the courtyards reshaped across generations. This incremental growth reflects a philosophy of stewardship rather than ownership. Each generation added what it could, strengthening what already existed, never assuming that their work would be final. In this sense, Bran the Builder's greatest achievement may not have been the physical construction of Winterfell, but the cultural precedent he established, that what is built should be prepared to outlast its maker. Beyond Winterfell, Bran's name is also attached to the raising of the wall, the immense barrier of ice stretching across the northern edge of the world. Whether he truly played a direct role in its construction is less important than the fact that later generations believed he did. The wall represents an idea even more ambitious than a castle. It is not a seat of power, but a boundary. It exists not to rule, but to protect. To associate Bran with the wall is to associate him with foresight on a scale rarely attempted. The wall was built in response to fear, but not panic. It reflects a deliberate acknowledgement that some threats cannot be defeated outright, only contained. In this way, the wall mirrors the northern understanding of winter itself. One does not conquer winter. One prepares for it, survives it, and waits for it to pass. The decision to invest enormous resources into a structure that would never generate wealth or prestige underscores a core northern value. Security is more important than expansion. Closely tied to the wall is the founding of the Night's Watch, an institution as austere and enduring as the structure it guards. Like Winterfell, the Watch was built on continuity rather than glory. Its members would renounce family, inheritance, and personal ambition in service of a duty that offered little recognition and no tangible reward. That this order is traditionally linked to Bran further reinforces the image of a man concerned less with immediate authority and more with long-term stability. What emerges from these associations is not a portrait of a single individual, but a philosophy attributed to him. Bran the Builder becomes a symbolic ancestor, embodying the northern belief that power should be expressed through preservation rather than domination. His works do not elevate one man above others. They exist to shelter entire communities, often anonymously, often thanklessly. It is also worth noting what Bran is not remembered for. There are no legends of him founding great cities, establishing trade empires, or forging alliances through diplomacy. His focus remained fixed on the north itself, on fortifying its boundaries and heartlands. This inward-looking approach would later define House Stark's relationship with the wider world. The North did not seek to shape the realm. It sought to endure within it. The architecture attributed to Bran also reflects an intimate relationship with the land. Winterfell's walls rise from the earth as if grown rather than imposed. The wall, despite its unnatural scale, follows the natural line of the continent, cutting across it like a scar rather than an ornament. These structures do not deny the environment, they respond to it. In doing so, they reinforce a worldview in which humanity adapts to nature, rather than attempting to subdue it entirely. Over time, Bran the Builder's identity became inseparable from House Stark itself. Later, Stark lords would invoke his name not to claim greatness, but to legitimize continuity. To rule Winterfell was not to inherit a throne, but to inherit a responsibility stretching back to its founder. Each Stark lord was, in a sense, a caretaker of Bran's work, charged with maintaining what had been entrusted to them. This emphasis on maintenance rather than reinvention explains much of Stark behavior in later centuries, where other houses rebuilt to suit changing tastes or political needs, the Starks preserved. Where others sought novelty, they favored tradition. This was not resistance to change for its own sake, but an understanding that some structures, once altered, could not easily be restored. In the North, mistakes carried heavier consequences, but the mythologizing of Bran the Builder also served a social function. By anchoring their legitimacy in a figure associated with protection and foresight, the Starks framed their rule as a continuation of an ancient duty rather than an exercise of personal power. This distinction mattered in a land where loyalty was earned through reliability, not spectacle. A lord who could trace his lineage to Bran was implicitly claiming alignment with the values that had kept the North alive. Whether Bran was one man or many, whether his deeds were literal or symbolic, his presence in northern history is undeniable. He represents the moment when survival became institutionalized, when memory took physical form. The stones of Winterfell, the ice of the wall, as in the vows of the Night's Watch, all point toward the same underlying principle, that the future is shaped not by ambition alone, but by preparation. As House Stark emerged from legend into recorded history, it would carry this architectural philosophy with it. Their power would never be flamboyant, their authority never absolute, but it would be resilient, built layer by layer, season by season, generation by generation, just as Bran the Builder's works had been. In the North, to build is to remember, and to remember is ultimately to survive, to understand House Stark. One must first understand Winterfell, not as a castle, but as an idea given physical form. Winterfell was never intended to dominate the horizon in the manner of southern strongholds. It does not rise dramatically from cliffs, nor glitter with ornamental stone. Instead, it spreads outward, low and broad, its walls thick, its courtyards practical, its towers restrained. It looks less like a monument to power and more like a structure built to be lived in, endured, and passed on. This distinction is not accidental. Winterfell reflects the northern understanding of rule, which differs fundamentally from that of the south. In warmer lands, power is often displayed. In the north, power is exercised quietly, measured not by visibility, but by reliability. A lord's worth is not found in ceremony, but in whether his people survive the winter. The name itself, Winterfell, suggests both violence and acceptance. It speaks of winter as something that falls upon the land, unavoidable and impartial. The castle is not a challenge to winter, but a response to it. Its walls do not promise safety forever. They promise shelter long enough to endure what cannot be stopped. This philosophy permeates every aspect of northern governance and is central to the Stark approach to rule. Unlike southern castles, Winterfell is built around warmth rather than defense alone. The natural hot springs beneath the castle are not merely conveniences, they are symbolic. Warmth is life in the north. To control warmth is to control survival. The Great Keep, the Broken Tower, the long hall where lords and small folk alike gathered, ye all benefit from this hidden heat. It is an architectural acknowledgement that leadership must address basic needs before anything else. This practical orientation extended to how Winterfell functioned as a seat of power. The Stark Lord did not rule from isolation. Winterfell was designed as a communal space, where retainers, guards, craftsmen, and family lived in close proximity. The Lord's presence was not distant or ceremonial. He was seen daily, judged constantly, and held accountable in ways that southern lords rarely experienced. Rule in the north was personal. The Stark in Winterfell was not merely a name on a banner, but a living figure whose decisions directly affected the lives of those under his protection. Justice was administered locally. Disputes were settled face to face. When punishment was required, yet it was carried out by the Lord himself, reinforcing a direct link between authority and responsibility. This tradition, later encapsulated in the Stark belief that the man who passes the sentence should swing the sword, did not emerge as a moral philosophy in isolation. It arose naturally from the conditions of northern life, in a land where mistakes could mean starvation or death. Leadership that delegated responsibility too freely risked losing legitimacy. Authority had to be visible, but not performative. Decisive, but not theatrical. Winterfell's location further reinforces this role. Situated near the center of the north, it is accessible without being exposed. It does not sit on a coast inviting trade and invasion, nor atop mountains proclaiming dominance. Instead, it occupies a space of balance, connected to forests, plains, and rivers. From Winterfell, the Stark Lord could reach his bannermen without delay, and they, in turn, could reach him. This centrality fostered a sense of unity rare in such a vast territory. While the north remained large and often unwieldy, Winterfell served as a gravitational point. Allegiance to House Stark was not abstract loyalty to a distant ruler, but a tangible relationship rooted in shared geography and shared hardship. When northern lords bent the knee, they did so not to a crown, but to a place and what it represented. The symbolism of Winterfell also extends to its godswood. At its heart stands the weirwood tree, ancient and silent, its carved face watching generations pass beneath its branches. This is not a decorative garden. It is a sacred space, a one that reinforces the stark connection to the old god and the values they embody. Here, oaths are sworn without witnesses. Prayers are spoken without expectation of response, and decisions are weighed in silence rather than spectacle. The presence of the godswood within the castle grounds is significant. It places faith at the center of rule, but not as an instrument of control. There are no priests to interpret the god's will, no rituals to legitimize authority. The Stark Lord kneels alone, as any man would. This reinforces a sense of humility before forces greater than oneself, a trait that would become deeply ingrained in Stark identity. Winterfell also serves as a repository of memory. Its crypts extend deep into the earth, housing generations of Stark lords in stone-lined silence. Each statue bears a direwolf at its feet, their swords laid across laps, eyes closed. These are not triumphal monuments. They are reminders. To walk the crypts is to be confronted with the weight of lineage, the accumulation of decisions made, winters survived, and failures endured. For a Stark Lord, this proximity to ancestral memory was inescapable. The dead were never far from the living, either physically or psychologically. This constant reminder of impermanence shaped how the Starks approached power. Rule was not a prize to be enjoyed, but a temporary stewardship held under the watchful presence of those who came before. This perspective influenced how Winterfell was defended. While its walls were strong, they were not impregnable. The castle relied as much on loyalty as on stone. Northern bannermen answered Stark calls not because they were compelled by force, but because the Starks had proven, over generations, that they would not abandon their people. In times of famine or war, Winterfell became a refuge rather than a fortress. As centuries passed, Winterfell remained remarkably consistent in purpose, even as its structure evolved. Additions were made, towers raised and lowered, walls repaired and rebuilt. Yet its role never fundamentally changed. It remained a place of gathering, judgment, and endurance. Where southern castles often reflected the personal ambitions of their lords, Winterfell reflected the collective needs of the north. This consistency explains why Winterfell became inseparable from House Stark's identity. To rule the north was to rule from Winterfell. When the castle stood strong, so too did the authority of the Starks. When it fell silent, yet the north itself seemed to lose coherence. Winterfell was not merely the Stark seat, it was the north made stone. In this way, Winterfell defines what it meant to rule as a Stark. Power was not extracted from the land, but invested into it. Authority was not enforced through fear alone, but sustained through trust built over time. The Stark Lord did not stand above his people, but among them, bound by the same winters, the same gods, and the same unyielding landscape. This model of rule would later place the Starks at odds with the political realities of the wider realm. Their authority, shaped by place and memory, would struggle to adapt to environments where power was fluid, transactional, and often detached from responsibility. But in the north, within the walls of Winterfell, this way of ruling made sense. It worked, and for thousands of years it endured. Winterfell was not designed to conquer the future. It was designed to survive it. Long before the North bent the knee to any southern throne, its rulers were known not as kings of a realm, but as kings of winter. The title itself is revealing. It does not speak of conquest, wealth, or divine right. It speaks of season, of endurance, and of a power defined by conditions rather than ambition. These were not kings crowned in moments of triumph, but rulers shaped slowly by necessity, whose authority rested on their ability to preserve life through the hardest months the world could offer. The kings of winter emerged from a landscape that resisted centralization. The north was vast, sparsely populated, and difficult to traverse. Rivers froze. Roads vanished beneath snow. Communication was slow, and armies were costly to maintain. In such an environment, sovereignty could not rely on constant enforcement. It had to be accepted, even welcomed. Power endured only when it was perceived as useful. What distinguished the Stark kings from other northern rulers was not an early monopoly on force, but consistency. Over generations, House Stark developed a reputation for stability that gradually eclipsed rival lineages. They did not expand rapidly. They absorbed, intermarried, and outlasted. Where other kings rose and fell through war, the Starks remained, their authority accumulating quietly, almost imperceptibly, until it appeared inevitable. The phrase King of Winter also implies limitation. These rulers did not claim dominion over all seasons, only over the one that mattered most. Summer brought abundance almost regardless of leadership. Winter tested governance itself. A king who failed to prepare would see his people starve, his bannermen turn away, and his name erased. Stark kingship was therefore defined less by lawmaking than by logistics. Storing grain, maintaining roads and keeps, settling disputes before they festered into violence. Unlike the southern concept of kingship, which often relied on spectacle to reinforce legitimacy, northern sovereignty was deliberately austere. There were no grand courts filled with poets and courtiers, no elaborate ceremonies designed to project power. The Stark kings ruled from Winterfell, a seat that emphasized function over grandeur. Their authority was reinforced not by distance, but by proximity. Bannermen could reach their king, speak to him, and judge him by the outcomes of his decisions. This closeness fostered a form of rule that was deeply personal. Loyalty was not abstract. It was earned through shared hardship and mutual dependence. When a Stark king called his banners, he did so with the expectation that those who answered knew why they fought. They were not expanding borders or seeking plunder. They were protecting what already existed. The wars fought by the kings of winter reflect this mindset. Northern conflicts were rarely wars of ambition. They were wars of consolidation, fought to remove threats that destabilized the region. The defeat of rival kings such as those of the Barrowlands or the Red Kings of the Dreadfort was not celebrated for its own sake. These victories were framed as necessary steps toward order, ensuring that winter would not be compounded by civil war. Even in victory, the Starks showed restraint. Conquered houses were often allowed to continue ruling their lands, provided they swore loyalty and upheld northern customs. This approach reduced the need for constant oversight and reinforced the idea that Stark rule was not about domination, but coordination. The North functioned as a network of obligations, rather than a hierarchy imposed by force. The religious dimension of Stark kingship also set it apart. The kings of winter worshipped the old gods, whose silent presence discouraged absolutism. Without priests to proclaim divine favor or doctrine, kings could not easily claim moral infallibility. Authority was grounded in tradition and precedent rather than revelation. A king ruled because his forebears had ruled, and because he continued to meet the expectations placed upon him. This spiritual humility influenced how justice was administered. Stark kings were expected to judge fairly, not because they were enlightened, but because injustice threatened cohesion. A wronged bannerman in winter was not merely an individual grievance. It was a potential fracture in the social fabric, one that cold and hunger could quickly exploit. Justice, therefore, was preventative as much as punitive. The absence of splendor in Stark kingship was not a sign of weakness. It was a deliberate adaptation. In a land where excess could not be sustained, simplicity became strength. Resources were directed toward fortifications, granaries, and patrols rather than pageantry. Even royal households were modest by southern standards, reinforcing the idea that leadership shared in the constraints of the land. Over time, the title King of Winter accrued symbolic weight. It suggested not only rulership over territory, but mastery of preparation. The Stark kings became custodians of collective memory, responsible for remembering past winters and ensuring their lessons were not forgotten. This role extended beyond policy into culture. Songs, stories, and customs emphasized caution, patience, and respect for the inevitable. It is telling that Stark kings were rarely remembered individually in great detail. Unlike southern monarchs, whose reigns are often defined by singular events or dramatic personalities, the kings of winter blur together in history. This anonymity is itself meaningful. Stark kingship was not about personal legacy. It was about continuity. A good king was one who left the North much as he found it, intact and prepared for what came next. This long tradition of restrained sovereignty also shaped how the Starks perceived external power. Southern kingship, with its shifting alliances and rapid changes, appeared unstable by comparison. The North did not envy the Iron Throne. It viewed it with caution. The Stark kings understood that power gained quickly could be lost just as fast, while power earned slowly through trust could endure for centuries. Eventually, history would force the kings of winter to confront a different kind of authority, one backed by dragons and centralized rule. When that moment came, the Stark response would reflect everything this era had taught them. They would not resist blindly, nor would they submit eagerly. They would weigh survival against sovereignty, memory, against change. The age of the kings of winter was not glorious in the traditional sense. It produced no empires, no golden ages celebrated in song, but it forged something far more durable. A model of rule suited to its environment, capable of absorbing loss without collapsing, and strong enough to persist until the world itself demanded transformation. In relinquishing their crowns centuries later, the Starks would not abandon this identity. They would carry it forward under a different title, shaped by the same land and the same winters. The crown would vanish, but the philosophy of rule would remain. The kings of winter did not seek to be remembered as great. They sought to be remembered as sufficient. The worldview of House Stark did not emerge from philosophy or doctrine. It formed gradually, shaped by climate, landscape, and a belief system that offered no comfort beyond awareness. In the North, faith was not something that promised reward. It was something that observed. This distinction matters because it produced a culture oriented toward restraint rather than reassurance, toward preparation rather than hope. At the center of this worldview stood the worship of the old gods. Unlike the structured faiths of the South, the old gods had no scripture, no clergy, and no formal hierarchy. Their presence was felt through place rather than proclamation. Sacredness resided in forests, in carved faces, watching silently from pale bark, in the sense that the land itself was aware of those who moved across it. This form of belief aligned seamlessly with northern life. The old gods did not intervene. They did not answer prayers with miracles or punishment. They simply witnessed. For the Starks, this created a moral framework rooted not in fear of judgment, but in the weight of being seen. Actions mattered because they were remembered, not because they were rewarded or forgiven. This emphasis on remembrance shaped the Stark understanding of blood and lineage. Blood was not merely inheritance, it was continuity. To carry Stark blood was to carry the accumulated decisions of generations, each one echoing forward. The family's insistence on maintaining clear lines of succession, legitimate heirs, and acknowledged responsibilities reflects this belief that identity was something passed down intact, not reshaped to suit convenience. As the phrase, "the North remembers," is often interpreted as political defiance, but its deeper meaning is cultural. Memory in the North is not selective. It preserves failure as faithfully as success. For the Starks, this meant that shame could not be easily erased, nor glory endlessly celebrated. Each generation lived under the awareness that their actions would become part of the same unbroken narrative that judged their ancestors. Ice, both literal and symbolic, played a central role in this worldview. The Stark ancestral sword, traditionally named Ice, was not merely a weapon. It was an extension of authority, used primarily for the execution of justice. Its size and weight made it impractical for battlefield finesse, but ideal for solemn purpose. Justice, in the Stark tradition, was meant to be unmistakable and irreversible. It carried out openly and without delegation. This approach to justice was inseparable from belief. In the absence of a forgiving God, punishment could not be deferred to an afterlife. Wrongdoing had to be addressed in the present, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. Unresolved transgressions weakened trust, and weakened trust could unravel a community during winter. Justice was therefore not an expression of moral superiority, but a mechanism of survival. The Stark worldview also placed limits on ambition. The old gods did not promise destiny or chosenness. There was no sense that the Starks were meant to rule all others, only that they were meant to rule responsibly where they stood. This produced a cautious relationship with power. Advancement was approached warily. Change was considered, but rarely embraced quickly. Emotionally, winter would come regardless of the Starks' belief system. Public displays of excess grief or joy were uncommon, not because the Starks felt less deeply, but because expression was tempered by awareness of impermanence. Winter would come regardless of celebration. Loss would arrive regardless of denial. Emotional discipline became a cultural norm, reinforcing stability in the face of unpredictability. Family structure reflected this restraint as well. Stark households emphasized duty over indulgence, education over privilege. Children were raised with an understanding of their place within a larger whole, rather than as individuals destined for exceptionalism. Even those far removed from direct inheritance were expected to serve, contribute, and uphold the family's values. The godswood within Winterfell functioned as a physical anchor for this worldview. Decisions of consequence were contemplated there, not because the gods would respond, but because the space demanded honesty. In silence, without witnesses, a Stark was forced to confront intention rather than appearance. This habit of inward accountability distinguished Stark leadership from more performative models elsewhere in the realm. Blood, ice, and faith combined to create a culture resistant to corruption, but vulnerable to rigidity. The Stark worldview excelled at preservation, but struggled with adaptation. Its moral clarity, while admirable, left little room for compromise. In a world increasingly shaped by politics, negotiation, and ambiguity, this would become both a strength and a liability. Yet for centuries, this worldview served the North well. It produced leaders trusted to act predictably, met communities bound by shared expectation, and a social order resilient enough to survive repeated catastrophe. The Starks did not rely on charisma or innovation. They relied on consistency. This consistency explains why the Stark name carried weight long after individual kings faded into obscurity. The worldview outlived its architects. It became embedded in custom, reinforced by ritual, and passed down as instinct rather than instruction. A Stark did not need to be taught what was expected. The land, the gods, and the dead had already taught it. In time, this way of thinking would be tested by forces that did not share its assumptions. Southern politics, shifting allegiances, and a realm increasingly detached from place would challenge the Stark belief that memory and duty were sufficient foundations for power. But those challenges lay ahead. For now, the Stark worldview remained intact, hardened by cold, sharpened by silence, and bound to a faith that asked for nothing except remembrance. Northern history is often misunderstood as a sequence of quiet centuries, punctuated by rare moments of upheaval. In truth, the North was shaped by almost constant struggle. What distinguishes its conflicts is not their absence, but their character. Wars in the North were rarely decisive in the way Southern wars aspired to be. They did not end eras so much as thin them, leaving behind fewer people, fewer resources, and deeper memory. For House Stark, survival itself became a kind of victory, repeated so often that it hardened into tradition. The phrase, "the long defeat," captures this reality more accurately than any chronicle of triumphs. Each generation of Starks inherited a North already diminished by what came before. Winters claimed lives. Skirmishes drained strength. Feuds lingered across decades, sometimes centuries, yet never fully resolved. The role of Stark leadership, therefore, was not to usher in prosperity, but to prevent collapse. Northern wars were shaped by geography as much as by politics. Vast distances made sustained campaigns difficult. Supply lines were fragile. Armies moved slowly, often forced to disperse or retreat as weather turned against them. Battles were smaller, engagements shorter, and casualties harder to replace. Victory, when achieved, came at a cost that lingered long after banners were lowered. One of the defining struggles of this era was the slow consolidation of the North under Stark rule. Rival kings and ancient houses resisted absorption, not always through open war, but through attrition. Border raids, retaliatory strikes, and cycles of vengeance became common. These conflicts rarely produced clear resolutions. Instead, they ended when one side could no longer endure the losses. Among the most persistent of these rivals were the rulers of the Dreadfort, later known as House Bolton. Their stronghold, Dreadfort, stood as a reminder that Stark authority was neither universal nor uncontested. The Boltons did not challenge the Starks through numbers or territory alone. They cultivated fear as a tool of governance, relying on cruelty to maintain control where loyalty was fragile. The prolonged antagonism between these houses illustrates a broader pattern in northern conflict. Wars were not fought to establish ideological dominance, but to determine which form of rule could persist. The Starks did not eliminate the Boltons entirely, despite having opportunity to do so. Instead, they contained them, as binding them through oaths and oversight rather than annihilation. This decision reflects a grim calculation. Extermination created instability, while containment preserved a tenuous order. Such choices reveal the Stark approach to warfare as fundamentally defensive. Even when advancing, they did so to reduce long-term threat, not to expand power. This restraint often came at a cost. Enemies left alive could rise again. Old grievances were never fully erased, but the alternative, perpetual cycles of total war, was unsustainable in a land already stretched thin. Loss was a constant companion. Northern songs and stories rarely celebrate victory without acknowledging what was paid for it. Stark kings buried sons, brothers, and bannermen with regularity. Entire bloodlines vanished quietly, leaving behind abandoned keeps and forgotten names. Each loss narrowed the margin for error, reinforcing a culture of caution. The Starks themselves were not immune to these costs. Their lineage thinned at times. Succession grew uncertain, and periods of internal weakness invited challenge. Yet the house endured not because it avoided loss, but because it absorbed it without fracturing. Where other houses collapsed under pressure, the Starks adapted by narrowing their focus, consolidating what remained, and enduring. Northern warfare also blurred the line between war and survival. Raids for resources during harsh seasons were not always acts of aggression, but desperation. The Starks understood this reality and often responded with measured force rather than total retaliation. Mercy, when it appeared, was not idealism. It was pragmatism. Killing one's neighbors today meant fewer hands to trade or ally with tomorrow. Over time, this accumulation of losses produced a particular kind of strength. The North learned to function with less. Communities relied on one another. Loyalty was valued precisely because it was scarce. The Starks became symbols of continuity in a landscape defined by erosion. Their authority rested not on dominance, but on familiarity. They had been there before the current crisis, and they would likely remain after it passed. This pattern of survival through attrition shaped how the Starks understood victory itself. A successful campaign was one that restored equilibrium, not one that reshaped the world. Peace was temporary by nature, valued not as an endpoint, but as a reprieve. Preparation for the next conflict began almost immediately. Now, the psychological toll of this long defeat should not be underestimated. Northern leadership carried a quiet fatalism, an acceptance that decline was inevitable, and that the best one could do was slow it. Optimism was dangerous. Overconfidence invited disaster. Stark caution, often misread by outsiders as rigidity, was born from centuries of watching promising moments dissolve into hardship. Yet within this bleak cycle lay a form of resilience. The Starks did not measure their success against ideal outcomes, but against survival itself. Each generation that held Winterfell, protected its people, and passed on its values represented a small defiance against entropy. By the end of this era, the North was unified under Stark rule, but it was not whole. It bore scars that would never fully heal. The Starks ruled a land shaped by loss, governed by memory, and accustomed to sacrifice. This inheritance would define how they responded when a far greater power arrived from the south, offering unity without winter and peace without endurance. The long defeat had taught the Starks how to lose without vanishing. Soon they would have to decide how much they were willing to surrender in order to survive. The end of the Kings of Winter did not come through sudden conquest or internal collapse. It arrived gradually, carried south to north by rumor, fire, and the growing certainty that the world beyond the neck was changing in ways the North could not ignore. For thousands of years, House Stark had ruled as sovereign kings, accountable only to their gods, their land, and their people. That autonomy ended not in defeat, but in calculation. The rise of Aegon Targaryen marked a turning point unlike any the North had faced before. His conquest was not merely military, it was conceptual. The Iron Throne represented a new model of power, one that centralized authority across disparate cultures and geographies. For the North, this posed a fundamental question. Could their way of life survive in a realm shaped by dragons and decrees? Reached Winterfell, long before any dragon reached Winterfell, long before any dragon shadow darkened its walls. The Stark response was not immediate resistance, nor eager submission. It was deliberation. At this time, the North was ruled by Torrhen Stark, remembered in later ages as the king who knelt. His decision to bend the knee has often been framed as an act of surrender. In truth, it was an act of preservation. Torrhen understood the cost of war better than most. He had inherited a land already accustomed to loss and had no illusions about what dragonfire would do to his people. The armies of the North were vast in number, but vulnerable in practice. They were composed of men hardened by cold, not flame. Castles built for endurance could not withstand creatures that turned stone to ash. Torrhen's advisors urged resistance, appealing to pride, tradition, and the legacy of the kings of winter. Yet pride had never been the cornerstone of Stark rule. Survival had. By choosing submission, Torrhen Stark made a decision consistent with the deepest values of his house. He sacrificed a crown to preserve his people. The act of kneeling was not a repudiation of Stark identity, but its ultimate expression. The North would remember its kings, even if the world no longer recognized them. In exchange for submission, the Starks were granted the title of Wardens of the North. This was not merely a change in nomenclature. It represented a redefinition of authority. The Starks no longer ruled by inherent sovereignty, but by delegated power, as they governed the North on behalf of the Iron Throne, charged with maintaining order and defending the realm's northern frontier. Yet this transition was smoother than it might have been. The Iron Throne demanded loyalty, taxes, and nominal obedience. It did not demand cultural transformation. The North retained its laws, customs, and faith. Winterfell remained the seat of Stark power. The old gods continued to be worshipped. In daily life, little appeared to change. This continuity was deliberate. Aegon understood that ruling the North required accommodation rather than imposition. The Starks, in turn, recognized that their effectiveness depended on preserving the trust of their people. By maintaining familiar structures, both sides avoided provoking unnecessary instability. Nevertheless, something fundamental had shifted. That the Starks were now part of a larger political system, one that operated on principles often alien to northern sensibilities. Alliances, succession disputes, and southern rivalries now had the potential to reach into the north. Decisions made in distant courts could carry consequences felt in Winterfell months or years later. The title of Warden carried both honor and burden. It affirmed the Starks' role as protectors, particularly against threats beyond the wall, but it also bound them to royal expectations. The North became a frontier rather than a kingdom, valued for its stability rather than its influence. The Starks were trusted to manage this frontier precisely because they asked for little and caused less. Over generations, the memory of kingship faded into legend, while the reality of wardenship became normalized. Stark lords raised their heirs to serve rather than to rule absolutely. Loyalty to the crown was taught as a matter of pragmatism, not devotion. The North remained inward-looking, but no longer isolated. This adaptation came at a subtle cost. Sovereignty had once been unquestioned. Now it was conditional. The Starks could govern, but only so long as they aligned with the broader interests of the realm. While this rarely caused friction in times of peace, it planted the seeds of future conflict. When the priorities of the Iron Throne diverged from those of the North, the Starks would be forced to choose. Still, the transition from kings to wardens stands as one of the most defining moments in Stark history. It demonstrated a willingness to relinquish symbols of power in order to preserve substance. The crown was gone, but Winterfell stood. Yet the title changed, but the duty remained. The North did not forget its kings. It absorbed their memory into its identity, quietly, without ceremony. The Starks continued to rule much as they always had, guided by the same principles, constrained by the same land. Only now, their endurance would be tested, not just by winter, but by politics. And in that new world, the values that had once ensured survival would be challenged in ways the kings of winter could never have anticipated. Honor within House Stark was never conceived as an ornament. It was not something displayed for admiration or wielded for advantage. It functioned instead as a constraint, a limiting force that shaped behavior by narrowing acceptable choices. Over generations, this restraint hardened into what might be called the Stark Code, an inherited understanding of how one must act, regardless of consequence. This code did not emerge fully formed. It developed slowly, shaped by centuries of rule in a land where actions carried immediate and lasting repercussions. In the north, trust was not easily rebuilt once broken. A lord who betrayed his word risked more than reputation. He risked survival during winter, when cooperation could mean the difference between life and death. Honor, therefore, was less a moral ideal than a practical necessity. At its core, the Stark Code emphasized accountability. Decisions were not abstract exercises in advantage, but commitments made publicly and fulfilled personally. This expectation extended from kings and wardens to the smallest household roles. Responsibility could be delegated, but blame could not. To command was to accept the outcome, whether favorable or disastrous. This emphasis on accountability shaped the way Starks approached justice. Punishment was carried out by the one who passed sentence, reinforcing the direct link between authority and consequence. Over time, this practice became symbolic of the broader Stark worldview. One could not separate power from responsibility, nor distance oneself from the cost of one's decisions. Honor also demanded consistency. A Stark was expected to act predictably, even when circumstances changed. While this created trust among northern bannermen, it limited flexibility. Where other houses adapted through deception or negotiation, the Starks adhered to precedent. Change was slow and often uncomfortable, but it preserved a sense of continuity that outlived individual leaders. This rigidity was not without internal tension. Honor frequently conflicted with expediency. Stark lords were aware that their code placed them at a disadvantage in dealings with more politically fluid regions. Yet abandoning it risked unraveling the very foundation of their authority. A Stark who acted dishonorably might gain short-term advantage, but would erode the trust that sustained long-term rule. The code was transmitted through example rather than instruction. Stark children learned honor not through lectures, but through observation. They watched their elders uphold oaths that brought inconvenience or danger. They saw restraint exercised when retaliation would have been easier. Over time, these behaviors became instinctive, embedded in identity rather than consciously chosen. Marriage alliances further reinforced this ethic. While political considerations played a role, Stark marriages were often marked by mutual obligation rather than opportunism. Betrayal within the family was rare, not because it was impossible, but because it violated deeply internalized norms. Loyalty to blood mirrored loyalty to bannermen and to the land itself. Honor also shaped how the Starks related to the wider realm. As wardens of the North, they were known for reliability rather than ambition. The Iron Throne trusted them, not because they were pliable, but because they were predictable. This reputation insulated the North from constant interference. But it also rendered the Starks vulnerable when they were drawn into southern politics that rewarded subtlety over sincerity. Across generations, the Stark code accumulated both respect and resentment. Some saw it as a relic, unsuited to a world increasingly governed by negotiation and intrigue. Others viewed it as the last remaining barrier against chaos. Within the North, it functioned as a social glue, binding disparate houses through shared expectation, even when personal loyalties wavered. Importantly, honor was not equated with moral purity. Stark history contains moments of cruelty, misjudgment, and failure. The code did not prevent wrongdoing. It ensured that wrongdoing carried consequence, and a Stark who erred was expected to face the outcome openly, without deflection. This willingness to bear the weight of failure reinforced legitimacy even in defeat. The burden of honor was heaviest on those closest to power. Lords and heirs lived with constant awareness that their actions set precedent. A single compromise could echo forward, altering expectations for generations. This awareness fostered caution, but also a kind of emotional austerity. Personal desires were often subordinated to duty, leaving little room for indulgence. Over time, this internal discipline became inseparable from Stark identity. To be a Stark was to accept limitation. Choices were fewer, paths narrower. Yet within those constraints lay a form of freedom. Decisions, once made, were not endlessly reconsidered. One acted, accepted the cost, and moved forward. As this approach served the North well during long periods of relative isolation. But as the realm grew more interconnected, the Stark code began to strain under new pressures. Southern courts operated on ambiguity. Oaths were tools rather than anchors. Honor could be performed without being practiced. In such an environment, the Stark insistence on sincerity appeared naive. Still, the Starks persisted. They did not adapt their code to suit the times. They carried it forward, believing that survival without integrity was a hollow victory. This conviction would define their most famous scions and shape the tragedies that followed. Honor, for the Starks, was never a shield. It was a weight, borne deliberately. And in the end, it would prove heavy enough to reshape their fate. Among the long line of Stark lords, Eddard Stark stands apart, not because he transformed the Stark legacy, but because he embodied it so completely at the precise moment it became most dangerous to do so. His life represents the point at which northern values, shaped by land and memory, collided directly with a political world that no longer operated by the same assumptions. What followed was not merely a personal tragedy, but a structural failure between two incompatible systems of rule. Eddard Stark was not raised to be a revolutionary figure. His upbringing, shaped in the shadow of Winterfell, emphasized duty, restraint, and clarity of action. Even his formative years spent away from the North reinforced rather than diluted these values. He learned loyalty, not opportunism. He learned to obey lawful authority, not manipulate it. But these lessons would define him long after circumstances changed. As Lord of Winterfell, Eddard ruled in continuity with generations before him. His authority rested on trust earned through consistency. He was known for fairness rather than brilliance, for reliability rather than ambition. In the North, this was sufficient. His bannermen followed him not because they feared him, but because they recognized in him a familiar pattern of leadership, one proven over centuries. The transition that placed Eddard into southern politics was framed as honor rather than strategy. His appointment as Hand of the King to Robert Baratheon was rooted in personal loyalty forged during rebellion, not political calculation. From a northern perspective, this made sense. Friendship implied trust. Trust implied cooperation. The moral logic was sound, but the environment had changed. King's Landing was not Winterfell. Its politics were not grounded in shared hardship or long memory. Power in the capital was fluid, negotiated daily through alliances, secrets, and perception. Authority derived not from consistency, but from control of information and influence. In such a setting, Eddard's insistence on transparency and procedural justice became liabilities rather than virtues. Eddard approached his role as Hand with the same assumptions he brought to northern rule. Law mattered. Truth mattered. Responsibility could not be deferred. These principles guided his decisions, but they failed to account for a system that rewarded delay, ambiguity, and misdirection. In the South, honor was something that could be performed without being practiced. Eddard treated it as non-negotiable. This disconnect manifested most clearly in how Eddard understood power. To him, authority was inseparable from legitimacy. A ruler who lacked rightful claim could not rule justly, regardless of effectiveness. This belief compelled him toward actions that prioritized correctness over survival. He sought to restore order by revealing truth, assuming that exposure would naturally lead to resolution. In the North, this assumption often held. In the South, it proved fatal. Eddard's refusal to act preemptively, to seize advantage before it was openly justified, reflected deep, internalized restraint. He would not arrest without certainty, would not strike without declaration, would not compromise principles to secure position. Each hesitation was an ethical choice. Each choice narrowed his options. What Eddard failed to fully grasp was that southern power structures did not collapse under moral pressure. They adapted. Truth became negotiable. Law became an instrument rather than a boundary. By the time Eddard moved to act, the conditions that would have supported him no longer existed. His downfall was not caused by ignorance. It was caused by misalignment. He applied a northern framework to a southern system, expecting shared premises that were not there. His honor did not protect him because it was not recognized as binding by those around him. Yet to frame Eddard Stark's fate as naivety is to misunderstand both the man and the legacy he represented. He did not fail to understand the game. He rejected it. His choices were deliberate, as shaped by a lifetime of precedent that taught him that survival without integrity was not survival at all. In this sense, Eddard did not abandon the Stark Code when he went south. He tested it under conditions for which it was never designed. The result was predictable, though not inevitable. His execution was not simply the removal of a political obstacle. It was the moment when Northern honor was publicly exposed as incompatible with the dominant mode of power in the realm. The consequences extended far beyond his death. Eddard's actions set forces in motion that fractured the political order he had hoped to stabilize. His refusal to compromise removed him from the board, but it also stripped legitimacy from those who remained. The realm would soon feel the absence of restraint that he represented. For the North, Eddard Stark became something more than a fallen lord. He became a reference point, His life and death reinforced long-held beliefs about the cost of honor, but also its necessity. He demonstrated that the Stark Code could still be lived fully, even if the world no longer rewarded it. The collision between Eddard Stark and the South did not invalidate the Northern way of rule. It revealed its limits. It showed what happened when principles forged for endurance were forced into an arena designed for manipulation. What followed would not be a retreat into isolation, but a fragmentation of the Stark family itself, as each surviving member carried a different lesson forward. Some would cling to honor. Others would learn adaptability. None would remain unchanged. The age of quiet wardenship had ended, but the consequences of Eddard Stark's choices would ripple outward, reshaping not only House Stark, but the realm that had failed to understand him. The strength of House Stark had always rested on unity. Not unity of ambition, but of presence. The Starks endured because they remained together in purpose, if not always in place. When that unity fractured, it did so not through a single blow, but through dispersion. The shattering of the pack was not an event so much as a process, unfolding across distances and decisions, each separation compounding the next. The death of Eddard Stark did not merely remove a patriarch. It removed the gravitational center that had held disparate lives in alignment. What followed was not immediate collapse, but a rapid scattering, as each surviving member of the family was pulled into a different current, shaped by circumstance rather than choice. In the North, leadership passed to Robb Stark, whose elevation was as much an emotional response as a political one. He inherited not only command, but expectation, an unspoken demand to restore what had been lost. Robb's rule emerged from loyalty and outrage rather than deliberation, and in that urgency lay both his strength and his vulnerability. Robb's authority was anchored in the same northern values that had sustained his house for centuries. He was trusted because he was a Stark, because his cause was clear, and because his anger mirrored that of his bannermen. Yet the conditions he faced were unlike those of his forebears. The war he entered was not confined to northern borders, nor governed by shared codes. It was a conflict shaped by alliances that shifted without warning, and promises that dissolved under pressure. As Robb marched south, the physical distance between him and the North widened into a symbolic gap. Each decision made in the field carried consequences for a home he could no longer directly protect. The unity of the pack, once maintained by proximity and shared routine, was now stretched thin by war. Elsewhere, the Stark children were scattered even further, each moving along a path that would redefine their understanding of identity. Sansa Stark remained in the capital, surrounded by ceremony and surveillance, learning that power could exist without honesty, and that survival sometimes required silence. Her experience stood in stark contrast to everything she had been taught, forcing adaptation through endurance rather than resistance. Arya Stark, by contrast, was stripped of structure entirely, cast into a world without protection or predictability, and she learned that survival could demand transformation. Where the Stark Code had once emphasized visibility and accountability, Arya's circumstances taught concealment and detachment. Her journey marked a departure from inherited values, not out of rejection, but necessity. In the North itself, Bran Stark and Rickon Stark became symbols rather than participants. Their absence from power created uncertainty, inviting opportunism and doubt. Leadership in the North had always relied on presence. Without it, loyalty became conditional, and memory alone proved insufficient to maintain order. Each of these paths represented a different response to fragmentation. Robb attempted restoration through force. Sansa adapted through patience. Arya through erasure. Bran through withdrawal into older, deeper currents of meaning. Rickon, the youngest and most vulnerable, embodied the cost of displacement itself. The phrase, "the lone wolf dies, but the pack survives," had long been a stark maxim, rooted in the belief that unity ensured endurance. In this period, the saying inverted itself. The pack was scattered, and survival became individual rather than collective. Each Stark lived, but House Stark as a coherent force weakened with every divergence. This fragmentation had consequences beyond the family. Northern bannermen, accustomed to clear hierarchy and visible leadership, found themselves navigating uncertainty. Loyalties strained. Old rivalries resurfaced. The absence of a single unifying Stark presence created space for disorder, something the North had always feared more than defeat. Robb's fate, when it came, underscored the limits of inherited honor in a fractured world. His adherence to principle, his reliance on trust, and his belief in reciprocal obligation proved insufficient against adversaries who treated agreements as temporary tools. His death did not merely end a campaign, it extinguished the last attempt to restore the old configuration of Stark authority through traditional means. By the time the wars subsided, what remained of House Stark was no longer a single entity moving with shared intent. It was a collection of survivors, each shaped by loss in different ways. The old rhythms, Lord in Winterfell, children raised under shared roof, bannermen guided by familiar presence, had been broken. Yet even in this shattered state, something endured. Memory persisted. The Stark identity, though fragmented, was not erased, and it lived on in habits, in choices made under pressure, in the quiet refusal to forget where one came from. The pack no longer moved together, but it remembered that it had once done so. The shattering of the pack marked the end of an era defined by cohesion. What followed would be a period of reckoning, not only with enemies, but with the meaning of survival itself. The Starks had endured division before, but never on this scale, and never with such lasting consequence. In the aftermath, House Stark would have to confront a difficult truth. Endurance alone was no longer enough. To survive what came next, memory would have to be reconciled with change. When the wars quieted and banners fell limp in the wind, the world did not return to balance. Silence, instead, settled unevenly across the land, heavy with absence. For House Stark, survival no longer meant victory or restoration. It meant endurance under the weight of memory, of what had been lost, and of what could never be recovered. Power in the realm had shifted hands repeatedly, but the North remained defined less by crowns than by scars. Winterfell stood as both symbol and wound. Its stones remembered footsteps that would never return, voices that no longer echoed through its halls. The castle had outlived its rulers before, yet this time the loss felt cumulative, as if something essential had been stripped away. Into this emptiness stepped Jon Snow, carrying a legacy he had never sought. Unlike those who had ruled before him, Jon's authority did not stem from certainty, or lineage alone, but from burden. He represented continuity without comfort, duty without illusion. His experiences beyond the wall had reshaped his understanding of loyalty, forcing him to see the North not as a static homeland, but as a fragile system dependent on cooperation rather than tradition. Jon's return was not triumphant. It was uneasy. The North that greeted him was wary, fragmented by betrayal and loss. Trust, once freely granted it to the Stark name, now had to be earned anew. Old houses questioned whether memory was enough to justify allegiance, or whether survival demanded new forms of leadership. Elsewhere, Sansa Stark had emerged transformed by captivity and observation. She understood power not as force, but as perception. Her strength lay in foresight, and in recognizing that endurance often depended on preparation rather than valor. Where others sought resolution through conflict, Sansa focused on stability, food stores, alliances, and the quiet management of fear. Her presence in Winterfell marked a shift in how the North was governed. Decisions were no longer framed solely by honor, but by consequence. The old Stark values remained, but they were tempered by realism. Mercy was considered alongside security, trust alongside verification. This balance, fragile as it was, became essential in a world that no longer rewarded innocence. Far from the halls of power, Arya Stark walked a different path. She carried the weight of loss internally, shaped by years of erasure and reinvention. Arya's struggle was not against enemies, but against the question of self. Having survived by becoming no one, she now faced the challenge of reclaiming identity without surrendering strength. Her return to the North, when it came, was marked by restraint rather than reunion. She was both familiar and distant, bound to her family by memory, but separated by experience. Arya embodied the cost of survival through transformation, the realization that some changes could not be undone. Above them all, moving along a path no longer fully human, Bran Stark represented a different kind of continuity. His awareness extended beyond personal grief, encompassing patterns that stretched across generations. Bran did not remember the past emotionally, but completely. In him, the history of the North persisted without distortion, preserved beyond the reach of time. Yet this omniscience came at a cost. Bran's detachment unsettled those around him. Leadership, grounded in knowledge rather than empathy, challenged traditional expectations. Still, in a world defined by repeating cycles of violence, his presence suggested the possibility of learning rather than merely enduring. Together, the surviving Starks formed a new configuration, not a pack in the old sense, but a constellation of complementary strengths. Where once unity had depended on proximity and shared upbringing, it now rested on mutual recognition of loss. Each understood, in their own way, that survival had required sacrifice. The North itself reflected this evolution. No longer insulated by myth or distance, it faced a future shaped by negotiation rather than isolation. The Stark name still commanded respect, but it no longer guaranteed obedience. Leadership had become a dialogue, as shaped by necessity and memory in equal measure. The weight of what remained was heavy, but it was not crushing. Loss had stripped away illusion, leaving behind something leaner and more adaptable. The Starks had learned that endurance did not mean resisting change, but absorbing it without forgetting who they were. Chapter 11 closes not with restoration, but with recognition. The past could not be reclaimed, and the old world would not return. Yet within the fragments of what survived lay the possibility of something new, an identity forged not by inheritance alone, but by experience, restraint, and hard-earned wisdom. What remained was enough. In the end, history does not conclude with conquest or collapse. It slows. It settles. It becomes sediment, layered quietly beneath the lives of those who follow. For House Stark, the final chapter is not one of triumph reclaimed, nor of tragedy repeated, but of persistence in a world that no longer resembles the one that shaped them. The North entered a period that chroniclers would later struggle to define. It was not an age of heroes, nor an era of kings whose names demanded reverence. It was a time of consolidation, of borders redrawn not in blood, but in agreement, of wounds tended rather than reopened. The songs written during this period were quieter, less concerned with glory, more attentive to survival. Winterfell, rebuilt stone by stone, reflected this transformation. Its walls remained thick, its towers high, but their purpose had subtly changed. No longer merely a fortress against invasion, the castle became a center of governance and memory. Decisions made within its halls favored continuity over ambition. The lessons of loss lingered in every chamber, shaping policy as surely as any law. The North's relationship with the wider realm evolved as well. Long defined by its distance, geographical, cultural, and emotional, it now stood connected by necessity. Trade routes reopened cautiously. Alliances were maintained not through marriage alone, but through shared interest and mutual restraint. The North no longer viewed isolation as strength, nor engagement as weakness. This shift did not erase the North's identity. It refined it. The old values, honor, duty, remembrance, remained, but they were no longer absolute. They were interpreted through the lens of experience. Honor without foresight had proven costly. Duty without compassion had hollowed families and fractured loyalties. What emerged was a quieter ethic, one that valued balance over purity. The Stark legacy endured less as a bloodline than as a framework. It offered a model of leadership shaped by accountability rather than entitlement. The failures of the past were not hidden or romanticized. They were acknowledged openly, incorporated into governance as cautionary reference. In this way, history became a guide rather than a burden. Beyond the walls of Winterfell, the land itself continued its cycles. Winters still came, long and unforgiving. Harvests still determined prosperity or famine. Yet the people of the North faced these realities with tempered expectation. They no longer believed themselves exempt from suffering by virtue of tradition. Preparedness replaced faith. Community replaced blind loyalty. The concept of rule itself underwent a quiet redefinition. Authority was less performative, less tied to spectacle or ceremony. Leaders were expected to listen, to adapt, to endure scrutiny. Power was no longer something to be seized, but something to be justified continuously. This expectation, born from loss, became the North's most enduring reform. Memory played a central role in this transformation. The past was neither erased nor glorified. Names of the dead were spoken plainly, without embellishment. Their stories were told not to inspire imitation, but understanding. Children learned not only who had fallen, but why. In doing so, as the North sought to break the rhythm of repetition that had defined so much of its history, across Westeros, other regions continued to rise and fracture, to crown rulers and depose them. The North observed these patterns with measured distance. It no longer rushed to intervene, nor did it retreat entirely. Its role had become contextual rather than dominant, responsive rather than reactive. What distinguished the North in this later age was not power, but resilience without aggression. It endured not because it resisted change, but because it absorbed it carefully. Its identity was no longer fixed to a single family, castle, or banner. It lived instead in shared memory and collective restraint. House Stark, in this sense, became less a ruling house and more a historical constant, where its influence persisted through precedent rather than command. Even as generations passed and names faded, the principles associated with the Starks continued to inform northern governance. The house had ceased to dominate history, but it had shaped its direction. There were no final victories to mark this era, no singular event to declare closure. The story concluded as most histories do, in quiet continuity. Fields were sown, councils convened, winters endured. Life continued, informed by what had been learned rather than what had been lost. The long quiet of the North was not an absence of conflict, but a conscious refusal to define itself by it. It was a deliberate slowing, a turning away from cycles that had consumed so many before. In this restraint lay its strength. And so the history of House Stark does not end with fire or ice, with coronation or ruin. It ends with endurance, measured, imperfect, and profoundly human. A legacy not of dominance, but of survival, carried forward not by myth, but by memory.